I wanted to introduce our next speaker from Infoblox. Tom Coffeen is the IPv6 evangelist at Infoblox, and he's been a leader in IPv6 for many years, has previous experience at Limelight Networks, and has done IPv6 deployments in his previous experiences. So please welcome Tom to share with us his insights on IPv6. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for that generous introduction, Scott. As Scott says, I'm Tom Coffeen, and I work for Infoblox, where my title is IPv6 Evangelist, a title that is hopefully slightly less ridiculous in this setting. It's a distinct pleasure to have the opportunity to speak in front of a learned and experienced group such as yourselves, and I look forward to hearing all the ways that I've gotten everything entirely wrong forever. I know it's right after lunch, so I'll try not to put anyone to sleep with a zillion slides or, failing that, disturb anyone's nap. Actually, my presentation is about 30 minutes, and we'll leave some time at the end for as many or as few questions as folks might have. So let's begin, tongue firmly in cheek, with a question, and that is, what might IPv6 adoption in the enterprise look like? And this is with apologies to Gene Roddenberry. So who knew we'd have interstellar travel a mere 5 decades from now? And who could have guessed IANA would still be doling out /32s from the original global unicast allocation? Is it only because we started using /127s on point-to-point links instead of /64s? So we have IANA's IPv6 allocation to United Federation of Planets, Starfleet, March 2063. You'll either be satisfied or incredulous to see that the rules for proper IPv6 address planning haven't significantly changed in 50 years. Most enterprises still get a /48 per site, and this particular enterprise is no exception. So let's make this a real IPv6 address plan. First nibble reserved for enterprise, departmental or location assignments. We'll keep it all readable by assigning our departmental significance to the first nibble of the subnet ID. 4 bits gives us 16 subnets. There are 8 departments, as we'll see in the next slide. We'll reserve 1 /52 for infrastructure spanning departments, and we'll set aside the remaining 7 subnets for future use. Here are our departmental assignments, 8 total, and I've kept it to 8 because that's exactly how many cool-looking emblems I could fit onto one slide and still keep it readable. We've got command, science, medical, weapons and defense, engineering, communications, shipboard services, and environmental engineering, which I'll assume has some responsibility for keeping the toilets flushing. And here are the functional allocations for each department, again restricted to the 4-bit boundary for legibility's sake. A /56 each for wired, wireless, voice over IP, guest network, control networks 1 and 2. And 9 subnets set aside for future use. It looks like I might have left out a subnet. Well, it's reserved for data. Meanwhile, back on Earth at the beginning of the 21st century, I've put a number of graphics on this slide that indicate why I'm personally skeptical that we'll have interstellar travel anytime soon. Back here on Earth, in spite of Charlie Sheen's heroic efforts, the regional internet registries are still running out of IP4 space in more or less real time. ACNIC is, of course, already out. By latest estimates from Geoff Houston's analysis shown above, RIPE will be out right around the time of World IPv6 launch. Aaron's predicted exhaustion was recently moved up from 2014 to 2013. So it's not news to this audience, but the internet must adopt IPv6 to continue to scale. So of course we're going to see more and more IPv6 connected hosts and networks in the years to come. Service provider and subscriber networks are of course helping to drive this change and are in most cases keenly aware of the challenges associated with IPv4 exhaustion. But the perennial question is, what about enterprise networks? What's the state of enterprise networks in terms of IPv6 adoption? So to attempt to answer this question, or at least shed some light on it, Infoblox has done a survey for at least the last 2 years, an IPv6 survey, to help to determine the level of interest of IPv6 adoption among enterprise networks. This year's survey included questions related to World IPv6 launch. Specifically, are you participating in World IPv6 launch? And if not, why not? So we'll start with this question first as a lead into the topic of the state of IPv6 adoption in the enterprise. So fully 2/3 of the 2,800 respondents indicated that they had no plans to participate in World IPv6 launch. On a more encouraging note, the number of enterprises planning participation in World IPv6 launch is 19% greater than the number of enterprises that reported participating in World IPv6 Day, so there is some improvement there. Note that participation in World IPv6 launch for most enterprises will still mean making public-facing websites, external-facing websites available over IPv6 and publishing Quad A records for them. As for the 2/3 of enterprises polled that are not planning on participating in World IPv6 launch, what are some of their stated reasons for skipping it? So this graph shows the various reasons that enterprise respondents gave in explaining their lack of participation in World IPv6 launch. The top 3 reasons given are that they have no plans for IPv6 adoption at all in 2012. Next up was that they're waiting for a compelling business case. Third was that they lack IPv6 knowledge and training. These reasons appear to be the same reasons that enterprises have historically given for explaining their delay in moving forward with IPv6 adoption. These graphs track the responses to the question, what is your organization's plan for dealing with IPv6? 1/3 of the enterprises surveyed said that they had either no plan for IPv6 adoption or plan to ignore IPv6 adoption altogether. Another third indicated that they are in an exploratory posture with plans only to learn more about IPv6 before perhaps proceeding. You may notice that these results are nearly identical from 2011 to 2012. So these results suggest that the prevailing arguments for enterprise IPv6 adoption continue to lack traction, especially when measured against the perceived lack of business cases for IPv6 adoption. Recall from the previous slide that that's a perception cited by 26% of the enterprise respondents as a reason for non-participation in World IPv6 launch. That is the perceived lack of business cases for IPv6 adoption. So unfortunately, the cost-benefit analyses to the case for IPv6 adoption are hard to come by, paradoxically, of course, because enterprise IPv6 adoption that might yield such cases isn't happening. And now for results unlikely to surprise anyone in this audience, there are 2 graphs here that permit the comparison of enterprise and service provider respondents on the question of commitment of resources to IPv6 adoption. Service provider respondents were twice as likely as enterprise respondents to affirm that they had dedicated resources such as capital and operational budgets, personnel hours, and training for IPv6 adoption. Continuing this trend on the question of how well educated on IPv6 is the organization's IT staff, service provider respondents showed a 20% total advantage across all positive responses. So service providers appear to have an advantage over enterprises in the areas of resource dedication to IPv6 adoption efforts, as well as IPv6 training and expertise. Such advantages underscore what appear to be a vicious cycle at work, one that impedes IPv6 adoption progress in enterprises. A lack of IPv6 training and expertise leads to a lack of confidence to deploy IPv6 incrementally. That is, in the absence of a formal and comprehensive plan based on management buy-in and the dedication of resources for IPv6 adoption. Meanwhile, the mythical perfect business case for IPv6 adoption fails to arrive. And all of the above conspires to undermine executive confidence to go ahead and buy in at a management level and dedicate the resources towards IPv6 adoption that would lead to training and expertise and the ability to go forward. So et voila, a kind of enterprise IPv6 death spiral, if you will. And yet, nearly half of enterprise respondents claimed that they had no plans to enable, nearly half of enterprise respondents claimed, rather, that they have plans to enable IPv6 on external-facing websites and internal networks at some point, with an average third of those respondents planning on doing so within 2 years. The parity in positive responses for enabling IPv6 on both external-facing websites and internal networks is somewhat remarkable given the conventional wisdom that of the potentially daunting scope of IPv6 adoption in the internal networks for enterprises. These graphs compare the time frame between enterprise and service provider respondents for enabling IPv6 on external-facing websites. Note that service providers have only a 12% advantage over enterprises in planning to complete this goal in the next 2 years. These results suggest that for most enterprises, in spite of all the initial ambivalence surrounding IPv6, getting their content online over IPv6 is seen as an important and timely step. Even in the absence of the vaunted IPv6 business case and the challenge of no training or resources for IPv6, the enterprise IPv6 death spiral, as it were, is being interrupted by more general arguments for enterprise IPv6 adoption. Such arguments draw their power to inspire action, at least partly from the unignorable consequences of IPv4 exhaustion. These arguments include risk management, business continuity and agility, and competitive advantage, all of which help make the case for why enterprises should care about IPv6 adoption. So first is the risk management, business continuity, and agility case. Here's a graph supposing the growth of risks and costs to an enterprise over time in the absence of any IPv6 adoption initiative. In other words, the enterprise that ignores IPv6 altogether could lose the ability to cost-effectively respond to the outside adoption of IPv6. Planned IPv6 adoption prevents a crisis scenario where an enterprise with no IPv6 adoption initiative must suddenly adopt IPv6 to keep critical services or processes online. It's all too likely that unmanaged service interruptions and uncontrolled costs will be the inevitable result of any sudden unplanned IPv6 adoption. Such a scenario may also draw resources away from other critical IT initiatives, threatening or reducing business agility. Next is the competitive advantage case. Enterprises that completely go without IPv6 adoption may be increasing their risk of losing competitive advantage. Whoops. Sorry about that. Enterprises that completely go without IPv6 adoption, there we go, may be increasing the risk of losing competitive advantage. Recall the scenario where customers are accessing IPv4 only web pages and coming from IPv6 hosts on the internet. Since one or more transition or translation technologies has to appear in the path, since IPv4 and IPv6 are clearly not interoperable, the technologies that provide this interoperability do so at a potentially reduced performance cost and degraded user experience. And of course, user experience is the cornerstone of competitive advantages for most organizations. So the following studies are almost old enough to have Unix beards, but still relevant in terms of what they suggest about customer behavior given website performance. The famous Amazon.com study that showed that a 100 millisecond increase in load times resulted in reduction of sales by 1%. A Google study that compared the difference between a 10 result page and a 30 result page and showed that a half a second increase between the two resulted in a drop of traffic and ad revenues by 20%. And then more recently, a 2012 study from Google, just actually within the last couple months, the results were published that showed people will visit a website less often if it is slower than a close competitor by 250 milliseconds. So recall that a human blink is 400 milliseconds. Enterprises need to be sure that competitors aren't already providing their content over IPv6 and avoiding any reduced performance, degraded user experience, and subsequent loss of competitive advantage. Edging even closer to an honest-to-goodness business case, it's not inconceivable that an enterprise without plans to adopt IPv6 might be stuck having to buy IPv4 addresses outright. Borders' recent bankruptcy liquidation led them to put a /16 up for sale, 65,000 addresses, $12 a pop, $786,000. Nortel sold their 666,000 IP addresses to Microsoft at $11.25 an address for $7.5 million total. So I think there's a bulk discount at work in there somewhere, but it's probably not going to help you much if you're only out shopping for a /23 or a /24. So where these more general and inferential arguments for IPv6 adoption based on risk management, business continuity, and business agility fail, IPv6 adoption in the enterprise doesn't arrive. A side effect of this is a keenly felt and persistent angst within the IPv6 adoption community. It's perhaps unsurprising that this year's World IPv6 Congress in Paris focused on enterprise networking. One reason for this angst might be a tacit understanding of the influence that enterprise networks have outside the enterprise, or to put another way, why everyone else should care about IPv6 adoption. In general, enterprises play an important role in helping to establish or evolve architectural and operational practice. This role impacts, for better or worse, the design and administration of networks in every sector, including the internet at large. IPv6 adoption offers opportunities to both improve and evolve, as well as deprecate existing enterprise network and IT processes. Such changes will have an impact beyond the enterprise, either by aligning with or influencing outside architectural and operational practices. So here's a list, some of the ways enterprise IPv6 adoption might impact the evolution of architectural and operational practices. Or a boy can dream. Deprecation of NAT is the first. Availability of enterprise content over IPv6. Evolution of IPv6 address management and network configuration and change management, leading to opportunities for automation and network virtualization. Unification of IP address space, leading to the deprecation of private addressing. Better adoption of the end-to-end model. And finally, IPv4 and IPv6 feature parity provided by vendors. Some of these changes represent the deprecation of limiting, inferior, or confounding technologies and practices, NAT and private addressing, for example. Other changes on the sample list suggest the evolution and improvement of architectural and operational practices. Some of these improvements may yield powerful second-order benefits. For example, IP address management and network configuration and change management are prerequisites to automation, to network automation, and ultimately things like the potential virtualization of the network layer. For our discussion today, we'll focus on the first three elements from this list: the deprecation of NAT, the availability of enterprise content over IPv6, and finally, the evolution of IP address management and network configuration and change management. So you'll notice here there's some verse on this slide. Since lucky you, I never pass up the chance to read poetry in public. Here goes. They found a formula for translating network packets. This formula for translating network packets paid, till in the end they could not change the tragic habits this formula for translating network packets made. I'm apologizing to a lot of people today, but this apology goes out to Robert Graves. It is in large part the entrenchment of NAT, of course, that so complicates the momentary path forward for IPv6 adoption in the enterprise. Given the early recognition of IPv4 address scarcity, enterprise network administrators often chose the architectural simplicity of NAT while downplaying or ignoring the costs of any operational and administrative complexities introduced by it. If those costs became acute for some period of time, that is to say, troubleshooting applications broken by NAT or waiting for vendors to release software patches to fix up those applications, they could always rationalize NAT's other virtues, however tenuous. For instance, internal private address obscurity somehow transforming into network security. Of course, NAT and private addressing have at least partially provided the nice long runway for IPv6 adoption we've enjoyed up to this critical moment. But there is much concern, of course, now that NAT will move beyond the enterprise edge to become an entrenched interoperability feature within an internet at large where IPv4 and IPv6 must coexist. The traditional liabilities associated with NAT at the enterprise edge include broken applications, stifled application development, retrograde security practice, administrative and performance costs. These liabilities could now have company in the core thanks to large-scale NAT and carrier-grade NAT, whose additional deficiencies are intimately familiar to this audience. IPv6 adoption in the enterprise may offer the opportunity to retire the entrenched architectural and operational practice of NAT at the enterprise edge. This could be an important step toward correcting the distorted cost-benefit analyses that continue to privilege NAT as a solution at the expense of IPv6 adoption. As successful as World IPv6 Day was, there was also a recognition that IPv6 content alone is for now insufficient to persistently increase IPv6 traffic levels across the internet, but it's still a critically important step that organizations make their content permanently available over IPv6. As we explained earlier, the competitive advantage case for IPv6 adoption for enterprises. Given the IPv6 adoption challenges that enterprises are faced with, The relative simplicity of making public content available over IPv6 suggests the reason why enterprises lag only slightly behind service providers in our survey in claiming plans for this step. This diagram shows a basic architecture to provide IPv6 connectivity for public-facing resources in an enterprise DMZ. An existing IPv4-only DMZ segment would be converted to dual stack, allowing both IPv4 and IPv6 interfaces to communicate with an IPv6 supporting firewall. Public-facing router would have connectivity to both IPv4 and IPv6 public networks via ISP or ISPs, providing internet connectivity. Dual-stacked web, mail, and DNS servers could then provide services to client requests arriving via IPv4 and IPv6, and Quad A records would make the whole configuration work. You'll notice, I think the important thing to notice here is that you've got an IPv4-only enterprise network, and that doesn't change. Basically, the goal is to get the content, public-facing content online and leave everything status quo on internal networks, at least for now. NAT isn't the only potentially retrograde convention in the enterprise network. IP address management in enterprise networks has often been done manually with spreadsheets. This method makes even the most basic view of address utilization in the network difficult to produce or analyze. And of course, automation of address provisioning or any integration with DNS or DHCP is an impossibility. The arrival of IPv6 complicates these challenges, making IP address management software and processes that integrate DNS and DHCP more critical than ever. The results of the survey shown in our graph above suggest that enterprises have begun to recognize this necessity. The availability of DDI, that is DNS, DHCP, and IP address management with mature support for IPv6 is a relatively recent development. Beyond facilitating effective management of IPv6 addresses in their own networks, enterprise IT administrators who adopt this technology are also contributing to the evolution of IP address management practice. Without such an evolution, automation and large-scale network virtualization will prove difficult, if not impossible. So this slide shows the evolution of IP address management over time as IPv6 adoption proceeds. An obsolete, ad hoc IP address management and configuration management regime is replaced with DDI and NCCM control planes as both a response to and a potential facilitator of IPv6 adoption. The deployment of DDI and NCCM control planes recapture operational resources that can then be applied to, among other projects vying for IT resources, IPv6 adoption. It also enables automation and any benefits resulting from it. And here's an obsolete IP address management and network configuration and change management regime characterized by multiple disparate systems that require multiple management approaches and expertises. Little or no integration exists between functions to allow the leveraging of a unified and intelligent view of the network. And here is IP address management and network configuration and change management evolved. A unified DDI NCCM control plane offering integration of IP address management, DHCP, DNS, network configuration and change management, and policy compliance in both IPv4 and IPv6 networks. So one of Infoblox's goals is to bring knowledge to bear on the challenge of IPv6 adoption for our customers and potential customers in the enterprise as well as the service provider space. The Infoblox Center of Excellence is attempting to do this by providing resources, white papers, one-sheets, a blog, videos, drawn from years of practical IPv6 adoption experience as well as ongoing direct interaction with the Internet IPv6 adoption community. So please visit our website for the latest. And to wrap up, even as the basis of a bit of humor, some in the audience might feel that Star Trek is too utopian of a cultural reference for the times that we live in. So in honor of all the sci-fi cynics in the audience, I offer the following. Meet the Weyland-Yutani IT department. They've been ignoring IPv6 adoption for decades, possibly even centuries. Even as their mining operations expand throughout the galaxy. Here's a picture of their flagship mining ship, the Nostromo. And here's two of their employees having a polite chat about DHCP and IPv4. I'm sure it'll all work out. Oh well. So if you forget everything else today, please remember that failure to adopt IPv6 in the enterprise will almost certainly lead to a grim fate courtesy of a face-attaching, larva-implanting, chest-bursting xenomorph. And with that, I'll open it up to questions if anyone has any. Yes? Yeah, it was not strictly North America. It was worldwide. And I did not break out the results based on region. I'm not sure that I have access to the data to be able to do that, but we were curious, and that's something we're planning on doing with the survey going forward, is breaking it out by both region and by size of enterprises to get more of an indication of sort of the differences by region and by size of enterprise. Sure. Yes? So the question is, do I have any basically estimates as to the cost of enterprise IPv6 adoption for small, medium, and large enterprises? And the answer is no, I don't. I have no idea whatsoever. And I think that anyone that tells you that they do is selling you a bill of goods. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. You're absolutely right. So, and the statement is that the first question a CFO is going to ask is, how much is this going to cost to adopt IPv6? And that's the challenge, right? Because it's the chicken and egg problem of not having sufficient enough enterprise IPv6 adoption to generate the business cases to then be able to take back to other enterprises that haven't adopted and say, look, here's how much it will cost you based on the size of your organization and the scope of your IPv6 adoption initiative. So then in the absence of the business case, we have to fall back to the more general and inferential arguments for IPv6 adoption based on business continuity and business agility, a competitive advantage case that's speculative. I think we can show that there's going to be performance differences between a session path that's IPv6 only versus one that moves through a transition technology and the potential to impact user experience and erode competitive advantage. And then finally, business agility, business continuity, and risk management, essentially future-proofing your network. But again, these are not necessarily arguments that you can attach a dollar value to make them compelling for CFOs and for IT enterprise IT management to make them go forward with IPv6 adoption. Yes. So the question is if I have any thoughts on whether there will be a significant number of IPv6 only hosts on the internet. And so I think the conventional wisdom there is based on the fact that there's a tremendous amount of expansion in Asia, where IPv4 exhaustion is already a reality. The fact that John Kern was talking earlier about, if you go to AppNIC to get IP addresses, IPv4 addresses, you can get a one-time emergency allocation if you're a new company, and then that's pretty much it. So any new hosts that are coming online, if mobile devices, whatever they are that are being connected, will have to rely on IPv6 to be addressed and to actually get out on the internet. So, there's still the question of where then a transition or translation technology exists in the path. Will it be at the edge where these subscriber networks in Asia are deploying IPv6 hosts? Will it be closer to the content that those hosts are attempting to access? So, there isn't really a clear answer, but the idea is, indemnify yourself against the potential, degraded performance and loss of good user experience by making your content available over IPv6, so that should there be an IPv6 path from an IPv6 only host to your content, that it performs as well as possible, and that you're not losing potential competitive advantage to your other enterprise networks that are in the same vertical that have already done that, have already taken that step. And maybe you're avoiding any problems with that sort of transition or translation that has to take place to connect those IPv6 only hosts. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions? Okay, I guess that's it. All right, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your attention.